A cold silence stretched across the void. The stars shimmered, distant and indifferent, as if they too were holding their breath. Then, a rupture. A massive warship, dark as the abyss itself, tore through space like a phantom emerging from a nightmare. It loomed at the edge of Xiphorian Sector 9, a territory no human had dared enter for over a century. And yet, here it was. Inside the alien command station, alarms screamed to life. Red beacons flashed in a violent rhythm, painting the metallic corridors in streaks of crimson. The air thickened with tension. Unidentified vessel detected. A sharp voice cut through the chaos. Admiral Virlan stood frozen, his twin hearts pounding against his ribcage. He had fought countless wars, watched enemy fleets crumble before him, but this was different. The holographic screen displayed the vessel's designation, HSV Revenant, a name long thought to be nothing more than a ghost story. A low murmur spread among the officers. The Revenant had vanished 50 years ago, swallowed by the darkness of deep space. No distress calls, no wreckage, no survivors. And now, without warning, it had returned, drifting silently like a tombstone among the stars. "Scan it," Virlan ordered, his voice betraying none of the unease creeping through his bones. The results came back within seconds. No life signs, no power readings, impossible. The vessel was too intact for a derelict. No signs of battle damage, no decay from decades of exposure. Just a hulking, silent monolith floating in their territory, its purpose unknown. Then, a signal. Faint. A whisper through the void. A message not meant to be heard. It didn't come from the warship. It came from within. A single phrase, looping endlessly in a distorted, broken voice. "They are not us. They are not us. They are not us." Virlan's breath hitched. The ship wasn't just lost. It had returned wrong, and something was still inside. Something that was never meant to leave. A silence stretched across the void, thick and heavy, as if space itself had paused to witness the impossible. Stars flickered like dying embers in an ocean of black, their distant glow failing to illuminate the dark omen that had torn through the fabric of the Xiphorian sector. Then came the breach. A warship, colossal and menacing, materialized from the abyss. It was a beast of steel and shadow, its jagged silhouette sharp against the endless night. The void shuddered around it, as if recoiling from its presence. The Xiphorian command station awoke in chaos. Alarms screamed through the corridors, a shrill mechanical wail that sent the station's inhabitants into a frenzy. Red beacons flared, pulsing like frantic heartbeats, casting distorted shadows along the sleek metallic walls. Officers rushed to their stations, tentacles coiling in agitation, eyes darting between data streams and tactical displays. At the heart of it all stood Admiral Virlan. He was a warrior, a leader, a creature forged in the fires of war, his scaled exoskeleton lined with the scars of 100 battles. And yet, in that moment, as he stared at the warship looming on the holographic display, a chill unlike any he had ever known slithered down his spine. A name flickered on the screen. HSV Revenant. Virlan's secondary heart stuttered. Impossible. A murmur spread through the command deck like ripples on still water. Every Xiphorian knew the legend of the Revenant, a human warship that had vanished 50 years ago, swallowed by the void. No distress signals, no wreckage, no trace of its crew. It had become a cautionary tale, whispered among warriors and scholars alike, an omen of doom, a ghost ship lost to the abyss. And now, after half a century, it had returned, drifting, silent, lifeless, or so it seemed. Virlan took a measured breath, steadying himself. Full scan. Now! The command deck fell into a tense silence as the scanners dissected the vessel, peeling back its secrets layer by layer. Then came the report. No life signs. No power readings. That made no sense. A ship of this size should be brimming with energy, its systems humming with mechanical life. Instead, the Revenant was dark, hollow, as if it had been stripped of its very essence, or worse, as if it was hiding something. Before Virlan could speak, the station's comms officer stiffened. A tremor passed through their elongated limbs as their eyes widened in disbelief. Admiral, we're receiving a signal. Virlan turned sharply. From the warship? A hesitant shake of the head. No, sir. From inside it. The air grew colder. The warship wasn't just abandoned. Something was still inside. A distorted voice crackled through the static, weak yet relentless, looping over and over again, whispering across the bridge like a dying breath. They are not us. They are not us. They are not us. Virlan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. This was no ordinary ghost story, no lost relic of war. The Revenant had returned, but what came back was not human. The Xiphorian command deck was deathly silent, but the Revenant drifted through space like a shadow that refused to be forgotten. It had no right to exist, and yet there it was, silent, still, waiting. Virlan's twin hearts pounded, his mind racing with possibilities. A trap? A warning? A mistake in the fabric of reality itself? Nothing about this felt real, and yet the warship loomed before them, a relic of a past war that should have remained buried in the abyss. The ship had sent no transmissions, no distress call, no challenge, nothing, and that silence was worse than any battle cry. "Run another scan," Virlan commanded, his voice sharp as a blade. The scanners hummed again, piercing the warship with their precision. The results came back in a flood of data, scrolling across the holographic interface. The readings made no sense. No life signs detected, but also too many to count. Virlan's breath caught. He turned his gaze to his officers, each of them frozen, confusion and unease creeping through their rigid forms. "How is that possible?" someone whispered. It wasn't. The Xiphorians had encountered dead ships before. Wreckage from forgotten wars, vessels lost to space's endless hunger. They knew what lifeless looked like. But this was something else. The Revenant had no heat signatures, no visible crew, no energy pulse. By all logic, it was an empty tomb. And yet, the scanners insisted there was something. A presence that defied explanation. A reading that flickered and twisted, refusing to be understood. It was as if the ship itself couldn't decide if it was alive or dead. Virlan clenched his jaw. He had seen horrors on the battlefield, worlds reduced to ash, creatures that feasted on light itself, soldiers turned into machines of war. But this was different. This was a whisper from the void, a secret that should never have been uncovered. And the decision lay in his hands. His claws tightened against the metal of his console. There were two choices. Attack first. Destroy the warship before whatever was inside could become a threat. A logical, strategic decision, or investigate. Board the vessel. Step into the unknown. Face whatever nightmare was waiting inside. The silence stretched on, heavy as the weight in his chest. Then, the whisper came again. The ghostly transmission flickered through the speakers, the same chilling phrase, a voice warped by time and suffering. "They are not us. They are not us. They are not us. A warning, a plea, or something far, far worse. Virlan exhaled slowly. We're going in. Virlan's command echoed through the silent chamber, his voice firm, yet beneath it lay something unspoken. Dread. The Revenant had drifted long enough. It was time to face whatever lay within. A boarding team was assembled. 6 elite Zyphorian operatives, trained for deep space incursions, each one carrying enough firepower to level a city. Their exosuits gleamed under the crimson glow of the ship's alarm lights, their breathing steady, controlled. Warriors, prepared for war. Yet none of them spoke, because this wasn't a battlefield. This was a graveyard. The transport vessel glided through the void, docking onto the Revenant's side like an insect clinging to a corpse. The airlock groaned as it engaged, a hiss of escaping pressure whispering into the abyss. Then, silence. Virlan watched through the command deck's live feed as the first operative stepped through the threshold. Darkness swallowed them whole. The interior of the warship was wrong. Corridors stretched like veins through a dying beast, walls slick with condensation, as though the ship itself had begun to sweat. The lights, what few remained, flickered erratically, casting fractured shadows that twitched like restless spirits. But worse than the sight was the absence of sound. No hum of machinery, no faint echo of life. Just the suffocating quiet of a place that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. This place is dead, one of the operatives whispered through the comms. And yet, the scanners still pulsed with fragmented readings. Something was here. The team moved deeper, boots pressing softly against the cold metal floor. Every step felt like an intrusion, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. The Revenant had secrets buried in its bones, and they were peeling back the layers, one cautious step at a time. Then, they found it. The first signs of struggle. Scorch marks lined the walls. Weapon fire. Deep claw-like gouges marred the metal, some running so deep it was as if the ship had been torn from the inside. Blood, dried, blackened human blood, spattered along the corridor. But there were no bodies, only empty uniforms discarded as though their wearers had simply vanished. One of the operatives cursed under their breath. Something hunted them. A flicker in the distance. A shadow moved. The squad spun, weapons raised, pulses racing. For a long, breathless moment, nothing. Then, a sound. Not a scream, not a word, but something between them. A wet, unnatural clicking, like bones snapping in reverse. Then, the lights went out. For a single, suffocating second, there was nothing but darkness. The operatives stood frozen, breaths sharp, fingers tensed against their triggers. Their visors switched to night vision, bathing the corridor in a sickly green hue. Shadows twisted along the walls, stretching unnaturally, like they had a life of their own. Then, movement. It started as a flicker at the edge of their vision. Something skittered. Not the heavy, purposeful stomp of boots, nor the metallic clang of machinery, but something wrong. A sound that didn't belong. Click, click, click. The unnatural noise echoed through the corridor, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The squad tightened formation. "Hold position," their squad leader ordered, voice steady despite the growing tension. "Thermal scan, now!" One of the operatives adjusted their visor, switching to thermal imaging, and then they saw it. The walls were breathing. At first, it looked like a glitch, an error in the readings. But no. The walls moved, pulsating with slow, deliberate contractions. The once sleek metal was now organic, veined with something black, living, and writhing beneath the surface. Then, the worst realization of all. They weren't alone. Shapes emerged from the darkness, slithering down the walls, detaching from the ceiling, rising from the floor like specters. They had once been human. The remnants of the Revenant's lost crew, twisted, deformed, hollowed out. Their bodies were stretched, elongated, their limbs snapping into unnatural angles. Their faces, what little remained of them, were frozen in expressions of sheer agony, their mouths locked open in silent screams. Their eyes had long since decayed, replaced by dark, empty pits, and yet they saw. They moved with unnerving precision, stalking forward on limbs that no longer belonged to them. The operatives opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the corridor in bursts of bright, searing light. The creatures shrieked, their bodies jerking violently as bullets tore into them. But they did not stop. One of them lunged. A Xiphorian operative screamed as clawed fingers wrapped around his helmet, piercing through the visor as if it were made of paper. Blood splattered against the walls. His body convulsed, then went still, except he didn't fall. He stood, his limbs twisted, his head tilted at an impossible angle, his voice gurgled through a throat no longer his own. Then he turned his weapon on his own squad. The horror was only beginning. The Revenant was not just a warship, it was a hunting ground. And the hunt had just begun. The Revenant was alive. Not in the way a warship should be, not through machinery, engines, or systems humming with purpose. It pulsed, it breathed, it watched, and it had been waiting. The Xiphorian operatives, once elite warriors of precision and discipline, had fallen into chaos. Their formation shattered, their weapons barely keeping the tide of horrors at bay. They were not fighting humans. They were fighting what was left of them. The creatures moved wrong. Their twisted, grotesque forms shifted as if they were half-formed, as if they were still becoming something else. Some were unrecognizable, bodies stretched, bones exposed, flesh contorted into shapes that shouldn't exist. Others still bore scraps of their past lives. Half a human face fused into something monstrous, an arm still clutching a rifle but the fingers bent backward. And worst of all, they learned. At first, they attacked blindly, driven by pure, ravenous instinct, but soon they adapted. They ducked behind cover. They flanked. They used the shadows. They fought like soldiers, because once, that's what they had been. One by one, the Xiphorians fell. The shrieks of the infected echoed through the corridors as they overwhelmed their prey, tearing into them with inhuman strength. Each kill was not an end. It was a beginning. The fallen warriors did not stay dead. Their bodies twitched, convulsed, changed. And then they stood again. The squad's numbers dwindled. Their ammo ran low. Their escape routes were cut off. And Virlan, watching from the command station, knew the truth. There was no victory here. There was only survival or annihilation. Then came the unexpected, a distress beacon activated deep within the warship. Not a Xiphorian signal, not from the infected, a human transmission. Virlan's secondary heart clenched. That was impossible. Every human on board had either died or become something else, unless some survived. Virlan acted instantly. Trace the source. Send a squad. Now. The remaining operatives, barely holding their ground, changed course, pushing toward the beacon signal. They fought through the twisting corridors, through the nightmare, until at last they reached the source. A sealed chamber. Emergency lighting flickered inside, illuminating a handful of figures in battered exosuits, human, alive, weapons raised, fear in their eyes. A standoff. The Xiphorians and the last survivors of the Revenant stared each other down, weapons trembling from exhaustion and distrust. Then, a thunderous tremor shook the entire ship. The Revenant was failing. Its core, warped and corrupted, was collapsing. If it went critical, the entire sector would be wiped out in a violent explosion. There was no time for war, no time for hatred. Only a single question remained. Did they fight to reclaim the ship, or destroy it before it consumed them all? Blow it. The human squad leader's voice was raw, hollow. There was no saving the Revenant. Whatever had taken it, whatever was lurking within, was beyond stopping. Virlan knew she was right. He turned to his remaining operatives, their once pristine armor now coated in the blood of their fallen. Set the charges. We end this. The mission was no longer about winning. It was about making sure nothing made it out alive. They moved fast, planting explosives along the core chamber. The Revenant fought back. The infected came in waves, shrieking in rage, in hunger, in some distorted echo of desperation, as if they knew their time was up. The Xiphorians and the humans fought side by side, holding the line as the countdown ticked toward 0. One last stand, one last battle, then the explosion. A fireball engulfed the warship, swallowing the infected, the corrupted metal, the horrors within. The Revenant, once a ghost in the void, was no more. And in the silence that followed, only a handful of survivors drifted in the wreckage, staring into the abyss. They had destroyed the ship. But the nightmare? The nightmare had only just begun. Silence. For the first time since they had set foot on the Revenant, there was no screaming, no gunfire, no twisted voices whispering from the shadows, only the endless void of space and the dying embers of the warship's wreckage. Virlan exhaled, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. They had done it. The Revenant was gone, a monster erased from existence. But as he looked at the remaining survivors floating in the debris, a handful of Xiphorians and an even smaller number of humans, he felt nothing close to victory. The price had been too high. The silence wasn't peace. It was mourning. Then, a flicker, a soft pulse on his console, a signal. Virlan's blood ran cold. Impossible. The Revenant was gone, destroyed from the inside out. No trace of it should have remained. And yet, the signal was coming from the wreckage. A transmission barely intact, its audio distorted, broken. But as it played through his helmet, the voice that emerged was clear. They are not us. Virlan's breath hitched. The same phrase, the same warning that had haunted the Revenant. The Xiphorian commander turned to the human squad leader, her face pale beneath her visor. She had heard it too, and in that moment, they both understood. The warship had been destroyed, but what was inside it hadn't. Somewhere, drifting through the darkness, unseen, untouched, something had survived.